Hello, I'm Dr. Alan Malik, and welcome to this first webinar in our series on how to set up easy, effective, community-wide screening programs. We've been at this for quite a while, so we actually started doing electronic screening way back in the mid-90s, and we've been evolving and developing systems and private labeling and all sorts of good stuff over the years. And we're basically done a lot of work in this area, and so we'd like to kind of present some of that sort of stuff and see if that can be helpful to you. So, the big thing we're getting to here is when we start looking at community-wide sort of ideas, we're really looking at, how do you get up into the, some of our locations are getting up in the 90% reach in terms of what they're getting to, and with pretty good breadth and so forth. And so we'll get into all that and try to understand how you do that and how do you do it without driving yourself nuts. So if we look at it, we come back to, kind of the first thing we're going to look at in the series is in this particular webinar today is we're going to get into, making a difference. And basically what ends up happening there is that you've already got programs out there. We're just trying to figure out how do you expand those and make those more effective and get better reach with them and so forth. And then what we're going to end up doing there is, you're going to see that there's a lot of stuff that you need to get into. And so your big thing is how do you simplify all that? And so in webinar 2, we get into how do you get those connections made and distribute the work and, do some automation in the process, start using some social media and so forth. And ultimately, when you put all that together, it really comes down to you can implement a program by just starting to download some apps and make some connections. And so in webinar number 3, we get into, how do you fund this whole thing? And the trick there is that you're basically trying to distribute your costs out with your workload. And so at the end of the day, it really comes down to, when you go to implement, just how do you download, how do you get going, and how do you make the whole thing happen, and what's it going to look like for you? So that's kind of like webinar number 4. So let's get into it a little bit. And if we look at the topic for today, which is really about making a difference, what we're really going to see is it's this idea of how do you expand that breadth and the reach. And in the process of doing that, you're going to make a lot more connections. And so you kind of want to do all this in the context of the social media sort of capabilities and technologies that we have available today. And as a result of all that, you're going to increase your engagement with parents. You're going to increase your engagement with providers, which are the big topics. But we also want to look at that more from a kind of a systemic sort of perspective. And so a lot of our work is really more around how do you make this whole thing work in a systemic view of the world. And so when we talk about that, what we're kind of looking at is, obviously at the center of this whole thing is the child. And so when the medical side kind of comes at this, they look at the child and they're finally kind of evolving out of it's just a bio sort of problem over to it's a psycho and a social sort of problem. And their big thing is realizing that both people and now they're starting to realize even all the way down to 1-year-old, a child actually fits this biopsychosocial sort of model. And they're really just equipped for the bio side of that. I mean, they're good at handling the immunizations and worrying on any sort of physical developmental sort of issues and so forth. And that whole medical side of things, which is, that's what they're trained for. But when it starts getting into the psycho side of things, then, they really kind of rely on either like an integrated behavioral health therapist of some sort or referrals to child psychologists and so forth. But they're really just trying to detect behavioral sort of issues. They don't really want to try to treat them and so forth. And then more recently, with your adverse childhood experiences sort of study that went through, everybody's starting to realize that, it's also all this social sort of side of things. What's that environment you're growing up in? And what kind of, experiences have gone through actually come back as pure, basically you're shortening a person's lifespan. You're, creating more physical health problems. You're creating more mental or behavioral health sort of problems. And so we're creating all sorts of issues and we don't even really realize it. And so that's all happening from the medical view of the child, but also the more of the child, essentially your early education, your early childhood sort of folks are also starting to realize that there's this whole developmental arc that you're going down, and you're basically trying to drive that in a positive direction. And the big factor there is about resilience. And so how are you building resilience in children and so forth? And these are things that aren't even being looked at from a medical perspective. And so there's all these different pieces going on just inside the child. And then if we pull back a little bit, we kind of look at, okay, well, another factor, they talk, multi-generation sort of thing, but basically you have to factor in here, where are the parents at? And how well can the parents actually take care of the child? How well can they help the child develop and so forth? And so what are their parenting skills? What are their resource levels? I mean, we always go back and we say that we have more developmental issues based on socioeconomic sort of issues. People will come back and there's correlations over to what's the education level of the parent as to how well the child's going to do. But they're all affecting that trajectory of the child. But how much of that stuff can you overcome? Should your programs be looking at educating parents along with engaging the parents and so forth? And so there's a whole piece there around the parents and how they interact with the child. And then what happens an awful lot from the early childhood perspective is that they're not really aware that the providers are probably the key players here, because the providers are the ones that are going to see the children. They're, especially in the 0 to 3, which is the most critical time, the providers are going to all be doing immunizations and so forth. And so the large majority of children will be in a doctor's office. And so if you can get those providers involved in what you're trying to do in terms of your process, they have the best access to children. And so you really got to pay attention to that. Now you got to realize, as we start talking about providers, though, it's biopsychosocial model. They're only looking to get their job done. And then after that, they're kind of like, essentially they're gatekeepers for the other processes and so forth. And so you need to think about screening as being kind of a detection sort of thing, and then help them get the referral done or get them pushed over to maybe an integrated behavioral sort of component within their own organization. And then start to work on, maybe even get them involved in social determinants and maybe have some case managers available in the community that can help them out and so forth. But, you need to look at the providers in their scope of the world. And so they have the best access, but, and they also can get paid for it, which we'll get into more, which is great. But they don't have time, and it's not their primary. And so you need to figure out, what are they doing, and how are they going about the whole process? And so you have 3 distinct players there already that are intimately involved in how the process is going to work for the child. And then if we start getting more into the early childhood education sort of things, and so, if these people are going to, an early childhood center and so forth during the day and so forth, now you've got a whole other group of people that can be involved in the process. And so, what's their role in all this? They can actually be doing detection as well as the providers themselves. And so you can have your screening programs that are easily set up in these early childhood centers and so forth. And then you need to get into, what are the services that you're going to be able to provide? What's your early intervention looking like? What's your child find looking like? How's that evaluation process go? And what kind of relationships do all those services have with the providers? Because the providers are going to be the primary people making referrals. But you can also have your early childhood centers and your early childhood educators making referrals as well. And so they're getting into the system. And then ultimately, as we get into more like the social determinants of health sort of stuff, if you start pulling those pieces in, maybe that's more directed at the parents and so forth, but it's a big factor for the child. And so you want to hook into, like the Help Me Grow sort of one door sort of policy where you get into, or basically based on the needs of the parent or the child or whatever, coming back with, here's a list of resources specific to your area and what you can get into and so forth. So there's all sorts of different ways that these all interact. And when you're trying to create this effective system, you're really looking at how do you make it effective in the context of all these different pieces. And so we'll talk more to this, but in terms of the type of work that we're putting together, this is primarily what we're looking at, is how do you make it work on a systemic level. So, one of the first things you get into then is just, you want to have some evidence. You don't just want to go off doing programs without any idea whether they're actually having any effect or not. And so naturally what you end up with is kind of, you're looking at the American Academy of Pediatrics. They have a set of guidelines. And primarily it's the 3 developmental screenings by age 3, 2 autism screenings in the second year, and now they're coming back to that you should be doing social, emotional, and behavioral sort of screenings all the way down to the first year sort of thing. And so big component there. The United States Preventive Services Task Force has come through and said, oh, okay, well, we should also be looking at maternal depression, shown to be effective and so forth. If you get past the early childhood sort of stuff, then you're starting to get up into just behavioral and mental health sort of issues, and there are guidelines around you should be detecting or checking at least once a year for those sorts of issues. From a national guidelines perspective, you get a whole breadth of different things that you should be detecting and getting into. And so as you expand that breadth, then you're expanding the effectiveness of your program and its ability to help the child. So just to run over through them real quick, maternal depression, USPSTF recommendation. And one of the things that we've found that was really interesting on this is that when you start looking at that in some of these larger organizations, they've been able to show a reduction in use of emergency services when they started their postpartum depression programs and so forth. And so not a lot of write-up on that right now, but it's one of the things that you do see out there, and people know that it's effective, and Preventive Services Task Force has said that that's where we should be at. So, a great one to get into. Obviously, developmental delay, we've been looking at that for 20, 30 years now. Obviously, that first 3 years is the big one where you want to get into. And it's the one where basically all these programs that are out in the world don't really have good access to, and that actually comes through your providers. And so you really want to figure out how to get providers rolled into your programs because they're the ones with the access. And we get into autism, which, that has been shifting all over the place. It's usually considered to be more of a medical sort of thing. And so your early childhood programs don't tend to look at that. But the reality is you just got to get it checked. You could be using an MChat out there in any sort of program. And just the fact that somebody's looked at it, because, the earlier you get on that, the better the overall outcome is. And, it's symptoms are there by, 18 months. So you should be looking at 18 and 24 months is the recommendation from the AAP. And it just really is not as much uptake on this. You see programs get in there and they started the developmental side of this thing, and they say, well, we're going to go to the social emotional, and then, we'll get into the autism, and they just kind of never get all the way there, but it's a big one. And then from the social emotional side, public health has been more around this over the years. It's evolved out into this biopsychosocial sort of thing. What we're seeing now is a lot more of behavioral health therapists are getting involved in pediatric practices, and so you're screening on the social emotional side over into getting people into the behavioral health therapists and so forth. Way back in the early 2000s, we were screening over into child psychologists and so forth. And so people are becoming more and more aware of this as this biopsychosocial model goes out there, and it's becoming a bigger and bigger factor. But it was really an add-on. I mean, even these ages and stages, social emotional, it came in after the developmental screens were put out there, and they just realized there was a bigger need for it and so forth. So it's one of those where the whole community and industries and medical communities and early childhood communities are finally realizing that that's where they need to be, and then they're moving beyond that even. And then, you got to realize that once you get up into school age and adult, you've already created a lot of these essentially behavioral and even up to mental health sort of things. You tend to, in adolescence, monitor some of the developmental sort of issues, like a strength and difficulty sort of thing. But, you start getting out into, once again, it's all guidelines and so forth at this point, and even to the point of you should be looking for major depressive disorder by age of 12. All the way out through adult, you need to be at least monitoring your depression and some of your anxiety and so forth. And it's kind of like taking a person's mental or essentially their mental health temperature is kind of what you need to think about depression as. And so it kind of indicates all this stuff going on. But, unfortunately, we baked in a lot of problems already in early childhood, and then you're just responding and reacting to those as you get out further. So the big thing is to do the early on detection and handle things as early as possible, which is all the way down to 1 year old, and as far as child services and so forth go. Kind of moving beyond that, I mean, that's how you expand that breadth, and that does that for you. Then, what they've always seen, and it's always been the problem, and the more and more as you start to integrate things, like that's kind of like the whole idea of co-locating a behavioral health therapist inside of a pediatric office, is that you can move them on easier. And trying to get people over to services has always been an issue. And so, you always have, your child find and your early intervention or some combination of those. But, the big problem is it's not just detecting, it's that you've got them over to services. And so we want to kind of look at a little bit at that sort of thing, and in terms of how do you, what can you do to expand and increase that capability to get people over to services. So I want to run through a real quick sort of thing about what we've done here in the state of Colorado to try to analyze this a bit. In the current model in Colorado, what we're looking at is, we got 377,000 plus children under the age of 5. And then when we go over and look at children receiving services, we're down in the 18,000. And our problem is that all we can see is what's coming out one end and what's going in the other end, and we really have no idea what's going on in the middle there. If you want to go through and actually get some control over this, you go in and you actually start breaking that down and start measuring things along the way. And so one of the easiest things to do is to measure the percent screened. And then from the percent screened, you're going to come up with the percent flagged. And then out of those flagged, then you can see, how many got referred properly over to, or appropriately over to services. And then you got some control over what that process is. And so, once you get those pieces in place that you're actually measuring those sorts of things, then you can go back and work with different providers or early childhood centers and so forth. And you can do a much better technical assistance sort of thing because you have real numbers to tell you what's going on. The big thing here is that you try to get to data transparency. It's highly motivating. You want to drive those screening rates and you want to drive those flag outcome rates. And so, did you screen? What'd you do about your flags? I mean, that's kind of what you got to get to. And if you can actually drive those two pieces, you're going to make your programs much more effective. So let's get into that a little bit more. So if you're driving your screening rates, I mean, what you're looking for is, you're really trying to promote 100% screening. You want to have that expectation. To do that, you want to engage the parents on many, many levels. I mean, obviously the easiest one is to go through medical, but there's a certain portion of the population that are not going to even see the medical doctor, much less if they go to see the medical doctor, will they have gotten screened and so forth. You want to engage them at your, basically at your early childhood centers and so forth, or your early learning centers. You can engage them online, even to the point now where, if you've got them signed up in a program, you can shoot them a text and let them basically follow a link and go get the screening and pull it back in for you. I mean, there's just all sorts of different ways that you can get to parents. And so, one of the programs we'll talk about later on, basically it's Grand County, their Meeting Milestones Initiative up here in Colorado. They were able to get their reach out to like 90%, and they're not even invoking most of the capabilities that you can do. I mean, they're not even using portals and so forth. So you can get very, very high screening rates and screening percentages. And so, ultimately you want to get out to 100%. And then you look at, okay, if we screened, then what we want to really monitor then is, what did they do about it? What was it when it flagged, which will automatically happen based on the assessment you're using. But what did you do about it? Did the provider not refer? Did they go under a watchful wait sort of thing? Were they referred? Were they referred to, basically early intervention or child find, or did they go to other, or was it a dual referral? Did the parent decline? Did the parent abandon the referral? And so right there, you've got information that helps you drive two types of engagement. So, from the provider's perspective, you can go in and do technical assistance around if somebody's not really, basically they're flagging a lot, but they're not really doing anything about it, then maybe you need to do a little training, a little assistance in terms of where should you go and what are your options, and maybe educate a bit about what is available and so forth. From the parent perspective, maybe you need to get out and get more education out to the parents that, if the parents are declining these things or they're abandoning the referrals, most parents are extremely interested in taking care of their child. So they're not, if you point out there's an issue, in most cases, they're going to do something about it. So But there's whole things that you can respond to there. But if you're measuring these things, then you know, okay, this is where we're at and this is what we can do about it. So you get real information when you start doing data across the whole thing. And then the other thing that we just, as everything evolves, you just got to realize, and, as part of our entire business has switched around. We went from these basically custom tablets way back in the 90s before there even were consumer tablets like iPads and Galaxy Tabs and all that kind of stuff. But, there's also this whole social media sort of concept. It's the concept of connecting children as a profile over to the different services, over to the providers, over to their early learning centers. Then having everybody get involved with the process in terms of getting the screenings done and handling flags and referrals and so forth. So there's this whole social media aspect. And then just even how you get to parents. You do it through a portal, a membership portal sort of thing. But then do you manage them inside the portal, which is really a more effective way to do things? Do you actually in medical offices or at agencies where, like a WIC clinic and so forth, what you may want to do is really quite effective is that you actually want to get those screenings done before they show up for the visit. And so now you start getting into, can you email that link? Can you text that link out to them ahead of time and get them to do it? You can even get to the point where, you're basically texting to the person standing in front of you at an agency and have them sit down with their smartphone and go ahead and take your ages and stages questionnaire. I mean, there's, the social media aspect of this whole thing is very important to get into. And then the other thing we start finding as we start doing this stuff where you're basically sending out before a visit, now you start getting into, okay, well, let's monitor and say, well, they didn't show up. I mean, basically you send out a text with a notify, say, a week in advance of when you want to get that screening done. And then maybe you go out and, automatically have your system check at, 3 days out and go, well, it's not done. Let's go ahead and send them a reminder. And this ends up being basically like an email campaign. And so you're using this concept of membership portals, you're using this concept of email campaigns, you're texting, you're using profiles. It's all this social media. And that's how people communicate these days. That's how people connect. And so you need to move your programs up to those levels if you want to engage parents and you want to get people into your program. If you want to increase that reach, it's where you need to go. So, talking about that parent education engagement piece, I mean, it's not just the social media sort of side of things. It was also back to that systemic sort of issue of, how do you engage parents? How do you empower them? If you think about it, screenings to a large extent are actually educational tools. As a parent, you have no idea what your child should be doing at, 4 months or 6 months or whatever, unless you are way into that sort of thing. I mean, when my wife and I took our first child home from the hospital, we were like, I can't believe they let us leave with this, new child. We were so inexperienced. We had no idea what was going on. And it just, this whole process of all this information that's available online, it's all about how do you educate those parents? How do you move and get the parents to adapt to the new social sort of capabilities and so forth? And now apply that to how do they raise their children better and so forth? And how do they, improve that trajectory for their child? Then we can look next at from the provider technical assistance sort of thing where we talked about, if you can look at those screening rates and those flag rates and those flag outcome rates, you take that performance data and you sit down with these folks. And so it's not just training anymore. It's, basically looking at data and being able to go, okay, here's what's going on. And this would probably be a better direction to go. At the same time, get into, how do we get you referred over into better programs and so forth? What's the other stuff that's available? How do you give them the tools? Because when they're moving beyond just the bio side of things over to those psychological sort of issues or over to those social, determinants and all that kind of stuff. I mean, they need resources and places to go with that information because they're just gatekeepers at that point. And so when you engage your providers, get them at a level where they can do that sort of thing for you. And then, the other thing you got to realize is from the provider's perspective, and we kind of get into this more into the business case and so forth, but the providers, they're in business. They need to get children to show up at their offices and so forth. So if you put together a program, which is kind of what happened up in Grand County, where, everybody's in the program and you're not, then all of a sudden you're going to miss a big market share. And so just from the very, business perspective of being part of a program, you can get them participating. And so that's kind of something we'll get into a little bit more. And then, out of all this comes this concept of kind of like a roadmap sort of thing, where you're trying to figure out, okay, how do I get my community to come together? Well, you kind of lay out, how do we refer? Where do we go to? Who all's pulling information in? What are our resources available? And in that process, you open up a bunch of doors and you get people working together and so forth. So it's all about making those connections. And so, road mapping is a great way to get the community to come together. What ends up happening in all this is that, you sit back and go, oh, that's all great stuff. But, at this point, we're just using paper and we're sending out surveys or at best, or we're not involved at all in the screening process. And so what it all comes back to is that technology has moved forward in a big way. So, this whole idea of electronic screening, we started doing this in terms of real-time results and so forth way back, with tablets way back in the mid-90s. And, it's evolved, and now it's to the point where everybody essentially has a tablet in their pocket because they all have smartphones. And so you shoot somebody a text and you get them to take a screening. You can get the information. It's available to you. But you do have to kind of flip over and start embracing that electronic capability and so forth. And then what we'll show in the next webinar is, once you get that data in, the big thing that you do is you're essentially, your clients are doing your data entry for you. So, that's one of the big hurdles about going electronic with information. But if you're using self-report sort of stuff, which is most of what is being done in this area, then essentially you're engaging your clients and parents and children. In this case, you don't get children, but you're engaging them to actually do your data entry. And once you get everything electronic, then you can automate things. Your errors go down. In fact, it would go down dramatically. There's a lot of error associated with paper. There's error associated with hand calculations and so forth. And then, at the back end of this whole thing, data transparency is nothing more than a couple more clicks. And so you have the ability to control your programs, do your feedback of TA information, and it all comes together, and it is really simple to use. But you do have to kind of make that step and go, it's time to go electronic, and that's where we find the biggest problem with people is getting them to take that step. But we'd like to show you there's really easy ways to do that sort of thing. We'll get into that in the next webinar and kind of show you how you can simplify and automate that whole process as moving forward. So thank you for your time. Please look down below, and you should be able to get to the next webinar off of the links down below. And leave any comments if you have any down there. And hopefully we'll see you on webinar number 2. Thank you very much.